Look at this photograph. Go ahead. Look closely. 14 people, arranged in perfect Victorian formality, staring at the camera with the serious expressions typical of 1880s portraiture. A family, parents, children, grandparents. Nothing unusual, right? Except that when this photograph was taken in a Cincinnati photography studio on March 15, 1882, only 7 of these 14 people were still alive. The other 7 had been dead for months, some for years. Yet there they are, sitting among the living, their images captured on film, with the same clarity, the same solidity, the same undeniable presence as those who were breathing when the shutter opened. This is not a story about photography tricks or double exposures, though the photographer would eventually claim he had created the image using such techniques. This is the story of the Whitmore family of Cincinnati, Ohio, and the photograph that ruined their lives, drove 3 family members to suicide, caused the photographer to flee the state under threat of violence, and created one of the most disturbing and hotly debated artifacts in the history of American photography. Because the 7 dead people in this photograph appear exactly as they looked in life, not as they had looked in previous photographs taken years before their deaths, but as they would have looked if they had somehow lived to March 15, 1882, aged, changed, dressed in clothes they had never owned, positioned in ways they had never been photographed before. And here's what made it truly impossible. The photograph shows the dead sitting among the living, in arrangements that would have required physical contact, with living family members' hands resting on the shoulders of corpses, with dead children sitting on the laps of living parents, with the transparent figures of the deceased occupying space that should have been empty, but that somehow registered on the photographic plate, as if they were as solid and present as anyone breathing in that room. This photograph should not exist. It violates everything we understand about death, about time, about the boundary between the living and the dead, yet it does exist. It sits in a private collection today, still disturbing everyone who sees it, still defying explanation despite nearly 150 years of analysis, investigation, and attempted debunking. Before we continue with the impossible story of the Whitmore family photograph and the 7 dead people who appeared in it, subscribe to Shadows of America and hit that notification bell. We release hour-long investigations every day at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. EST. Let us know in the comments what state you're watching from, and share this video with someone who needs to hear these forgotten stories. Because what happened to the Whitmore family in 1882 will challenge everything you think you know about photography, death, and the possibility that sometimes the dead don't stay gone. Cincinnati, Ohio in 1882 was a thriving industrial city on the Ohio River, with a population of over 250,000 people, extensive manufacturing operations, a vibrant commercial district, and a wealthy class of merchants and professionals who lived in grand homes in neighborhoods like Mount Auburn and Clifton. The city was known for its German immigrant population, its brewing industry, its contributions to the arts and culture, and its role as a major hub for transportation and trade between the East Coast and the expanding Midwest. Photography had been established in Cincinnati since the 1840s, and by the 1880s, the city had dozens of photography studios serving clients who wanted portraits of themselves and their families. Photography was still a relatively formal and expensive process, requiring subjects to sit motionless for extended periods while the photographer prepared plates and exposed them to light. Most families had photographs taken only on special occasions or at intervals of several years, creating a permanent record of how they looked at particular moments in their lives. The Whitmore family had been prominent in Cincinnati society for 2 generations. Samuel Whitmore, the family patriarch in 1882, was 64 years old and had made his fortune in river shipping before retiring in the 1870s. He lived with his wife, Elizabeth, age 61, in a substantial house on Vine Street in the Mount Auburn neighborhood. The couple had 9 children, of whom 7 had survived to adulthood, and by 1882, they had 14 grandchildren. It was a large, extended family that remained close-knit, despite the deaths and losses that had affected them, as they had affected most families in an era of high mortality and limited medical care. The idea of having a large family portrait taken had emerged during the Christmas holidays of 1881, when multiple branches of the family had gathered at Samuel and Elizabeth's house. Several family members suggested that they should have a formal photograph made that would capture as many Whitmores as possible in a single image, creating a record that could be treasured and that could serve as a reference for future generations who would want to know what their ancestors had looked like. But the logistics of gathering such a large family proved difficult. Some family members lived in other cities and could visit only occasionally. Others had work or other commitments that made it hard to find a time when everyone could be present. The winter of 1881 to 1882 was particularly harsh, with heavy snows that made travel difficult and that kept people confined to their homes for weeks at a time. Various dates for the photograph were proposed and then postponed as circumstances prevented everyone from being present. Finally, in early March of 1882, a date was set, March 15th, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, at the studio of photographer Marcus Bellamy on 4th Street in downtown Cincinnati. Bellamy was one of the most respected photographers in the city, known for his skill with large group portraits, and for his ability to produce clear, well-composed images, even with challenging subjects. The Whitmore family had used Bellamy's services before for individual and small group portraits, and Samuel Whitmore trusted him to handle the complex task of photographing such a large family gathering. As March 15th approached, family members made plans to attend. Some would need to travel from outlying areas. Others would need to arrange for time away from work or to find care for young children who wouldn't be part of the photograph. There was the usual discussion about what to wear, about how to arrange people for the portrait, about whether certain family members who had had disagreements or tensions should be positioned near each other or kept separate to avoid any awkwardness that might be visible in the final image. But as the date drew closer, something strange began to happen within the Whitmore family. Several members reported having vivid, disturbing dreams about deceased relatives, dreams that felt more like actual visits than like normal dream experiences. Elizabeth Whitmore told her daughter Margaret that she had dreamed about her mother, who had died in 1875, and that in the dream, her mother had insisted she needed to be in the family photograph, that it was very important that she not be left out, that the family needed to be complete. Margaret herself reported a similar dream about her infant son Thomas, who had died in 1879 at just 8 months old. In the dream, Thomas had appeared not as an infant, but as a 3-year-old child, the age he would have been if he had lived, and he had told his mother that he wanted to be in the family picture, that he was still part of the family, even though he was gone. Margaret woke from this dream in tears, deeply shaken by how real it had seemed, by how clearly she had seen and heard her dead son. Other family members reported similar experiences. Samuel's brother Daniel, who had died in a carriage accident in 1880, appeared to multiple family members in dreams during the week before the photograph was scheduled, always with the same message: he wanted to be included, he was still part of the family, he needed to be in the picture. These shared dream experiences created unease within the family, a sense that something unusual was happening, that the boundary between the living and the dead was somehow thinner than it should be. Some family members proposed postponing the photograph feeling that the strange dreams were a bad omen, and that proceeding with the portrait, while everyone was experiencing such disturbing visions, might lead to problems. But others argued that the dreams, if they meant anything at all, suggested that the deceased family members wanted the photograph to be taken, that they approved of the family coming together in this way. Samuel Whitmore, who was not generally superstitious, but who had been moved by his own dreams of his deceased parents, decided that the photograph should proceed as planned. On the morning of March 15, 1882, 14 living members of the Whitmore family prepared to travel to Marcus Bellamy's photography studio. They included Samuel and Elizabeth, 3 of their adult children, Margaret, William, and James, along with Margaret's husband Robert, and their 2 surviving children, William's wife Catherine, and their infant daughter, and James's wife Sarah. Also included were 2 of Samuel's brothers and their wives, the brothers both having survived while Daniel had died in the accident that had claimed him 2 years earlier. The family gathered at Samuel's house at noon, checking that everyone was properly dressed and groomed for the formal portrait. There was some nervousness, the usual anxiety that accompanies important photographs, where people want to look their best, and where there's concern about whether children will cooperate and sit still. But there was also an undercurrent of unease related to the strange dreams that so many family members had experienced, a sense that something about this photograph was different from normal, that they were participating in something that had taken on significance beyond just creating a family record. The group traveled together to Bellamy's studio, arriving a few minutes before 2 o'clock. The studio occupied the upper floor of a commercial building, with large windows that provided the natural light necessary for photography, and with various props, backdrops, and furniture pieces that could be arranged to create appropriate settings for portraits. Bellamy greeted the family and began the process of positioning them for the photograph, arranging people in 3 rows with the older adults seated in front, younger adults standing in the middle, and children positioned where they would be visible. This arrangement process took considerable time, as Bellamy worked to create a composition that would be visually balanced, that would ensure everyone was clearly visible, and that would produce an aesthetically pleasing image. Family members shifted positions multiple times, as Bellamy made adjustments, moving someone slightly to the left, asking another to turn their body at a different angle, repositioning children who had been hidden behind adults. The photographer's assistant helped with the arrangements, adjusting clothing, making sure hair was neat, ensuring that everyone understood they would need to remain absolutely still once the exposure began. As this positioning was taking place, several family members later reported feeling strange sensations, as if the room had become crowded with more people than were actually present, as if invisible bodies were pressing close to them in ways that made them uncomfortable. Margaret mentioned to her husband that she felt her deceased son nearby, that she could sense his presence even though she couldn't see him. Elizabeth whispered to Samuel that she felt her mother standing behind her, that she could feel a hand resting on her shoulder, even though when she looked, there was no one there. Marcus Bellamy himself later testified that he had felt unusual during the preparation of this photograph, though he couldn't identify what exactly seemed wrong. He described a sense of unease, a feeling that something about this session was different from the hundreds of other family portraits he had done. The air in the studio felt heavy, he said, and he found himself having difficulty concentrating on the technical aspects of his work, as if his attention kept being drawn to parts of the room where there was nothing to see but where he felt compelled to look anyway. By 3 o'clock, Bellamy had arranged the 14 family members to his satisfaction and was ready to make the exposure. He explained to the group that they would need to remain completely motionless for approximately 30 seconds while the photographic plate was exposed, that any movement during this time would result in blurring that would ruin the image. He asked everyone to take a deep breath, to settle themselves, to focus on remaining still, and maintaining the same expression throughout the exposure. Bellamy retreated to his camera, a large view camera mounted on a sturdy tripod, and prepared the photographic plate. He inserted the plate holder, removed the dark slide to expose the plate, and removed the lens cap to begin the exposure. For 30 seconds, the 14 members of the Whitmore family sat or stood motionless in Bellamy's studio, staring at the camera's lens, holding their poses and their expressions as the light streamed through the windows and recorded their images on the sensitized glass plate. When the exposure was complete, Bellamy replaced the lens cap, inserted the dark slide, and removed the plate holder. He thanked the family for their patience and told them that he would develop the plate immediately to ensure that the exposure had been successful, that if there were any problems he would need to reshoot the portrait while they were still present and arranged. The family relaxed, moving from their posed positions, some stretching, others immediately beginning conversations or checking on children who had needed to remain still for what must have felt like a very long time to young bodies full of energy. Bellamy took the exposed plate to his dark room, a small room adjacent to the studio that was equipped with chemical baths and the other materials necessary for developing photographic images. His assistant accompanied him, as was normal practice, to help with the development process. For approximately 20 minutes, the Whitmore family waited in the studio, some sitting in the chairs that had been used for the photograph, others standing and looking out the windows at the street below, all of them expecting that Bellamy would soon emerge with confirmation that the photograph had been successful and that they could go home. But when Bellamy finally came out of the dark room, his expression was strange, pale, shocked, confused. He was holding the developed photographic plate carefully, handling it as if it were something dangerous or contaminated. His assistant followed behind him, also looking disturbed, occasionally glancing at the plate and then looking away, as if he couldn't bear to see it. The family members immediately sensed that something was wrong, that whatever Bellamy had seen on the developed plate had shaken him in ways that went beyond normal photographic problems or technical failures. Bellamy approached Samuel Whitmore and asked to speak with him privately, but Samuel insisted that whatever Bellamy needed to say could be said in front of the entire family. Bellamy hesitated, then held up the photographic plate so that the family could see it. In the dim light of the studio, the image was difficult to make out clearly, but several people gasped or made sounds of shock as they looked at it. What they were seeing was impossible, a violation of everything they understood about photography and reality. The developed plate showed not 14 people, but what appeared to be twice that many. The 14 living family members who had posed for the photograph were there, clearly visible, positioned exactly as they had been arranged. But among them, between them, behind them, were additional figures, 7 more people who appeared in the photograph, even though they had not been present in the studio when the image was captured. And these additional figures were immediately recognizable to the family members as deceased relatives, people who had died months or years before, but who now appeared in the photograph as clearly and solidly as the living people who had actually posed. Elizabeth Whitmore's mother appeared in the photograph, standing directly behind Elizabeth, with her hands resting on Elizabeth's shoulders, positioned in a way that would have been impossible if she hadn't been physically present during the exposure. Margaret's infant son Thomas appeared not as the 8-month-old who had died, but as a 3-year-old child, exactly as he had appeared in Margaret's dream, sitting on his mother's lap in a position that should have been empty, but that the photograph showed was occupied. Samuel's brother Daniel appeared standing among his surviving brothers, his image as clear and detailed as theirs, dressed in clothes that matched what the living family members were wearing, looking not as he had looked in photographs taken before his death, but as he might have looked if he had lived to age along with his brothers. 4 other deceased family members also appeared in the photograph, all positioned among the living in ways that suggested they had been physically present during the exposure, that they had been standing or sitting in specific locations within the studio, even though no one alive had seen them there. The dead appeared with the same photographic clarity as the living, with the same resolution of detail, the same depth of field, the same tonal values. They were not ghostly or transparent or obviously different from the living, except that everyone looking at the photograph knew they should not be there, that their presence in the image was impossible. The family's reaction was a mixture of shock, fear, fascination, and grief. Some members immediately began crying, overwhelmed by seeing deceased loved ones in such a vivid and unexpected way. Others reacted with disbelief, insisting that there must be some explanation, that Bellamy must have somehow manipulated the image or created the appearance of the deceased through photographic trickery. Still others felt an immediate sense of wrongness, a conviction that something terrible had happened, that a boundary that should not be crossed had been violated, that the presence of the dead in the photograph was not a blessing but a curse or a warning. Marcus Bellamy himself was completely mystified. He insisted that he had done nothing unusual in taking or developing the photograph, that he had used standard techniques and materials, that there was no way he could have produced the images of the deceased people, even if he had wanted to. He suggested that perhaps some previous exposure on the plate had not been fully removed, that perhaps images from an earlier photograph had somehow persisted and had been recorded again, along with the Whitmore family. But he acknowledged that this explanation didn't make sense, that the deceased people appeared in positions and arrangements that suggested they had been present specifically for this exposure, not that they were residual images from some completely different photographic session. The family left Bellamy's studio in a state of profound distress, taking the photograph with them, despite Bellamy's suggestion that it might be better to destroy it, or to attempt another exposure under more controlled conditions. Samuel Whitmore paid Bellamy for his work, but asked him not to speak publicly about what had occurred, not to share the photograph or stories about it with anyone outside the family. Bellamy agreed to this request, though he was clearly troubled by what had happened and confused about how to understand or explain it. Over the following days, the Whitmore family wrestled with what to do about the photograph and what it might mean. Some members wanted to destroy it immediately, feeling that it was cursed or dangerous, and that keeping it would only invite more supernatural intervention or trouble. Others argued that it should be preserved as evidence of something extraordinary, that whatever had caused the deceased family members to appear in the image was important and should be studied rather than ignored or hidden. Still others were simply paralyzed by confusion and fear, unable to decide how to respond to something that challenged their most basic assumptions about reality. During this period of debate and uncertainty, strange events continued to occur within the family. Several members reported seeing the deceased relatives who had appeared in the photograph, not just in dreams, but in what seemed like waking visions or actual encounters. Elizabeth Whitmore claimed that she saw her mother sitting in her parlor on multiple occasions, that she could converse with her mother even though she knew rationally that her mother was dead. Margaret reported that her deceased son appeared to her constantly, that she could see him playing in the house, that he seemed to be trying to communicate something to her, though she couldn't understand what. These experiences were deeply distressing to those who had them, creating a sense that the boundary between life and death had become dangerously permeable within the Whitmore family, that the photograph had somehow opened a door that should have remained closed. Family members who had initially been fascinated by seeing their deceased loved ones in the photograph began to feel differently as the visions and encounters continued, as it became clear that something had been triggered that was not easily controlled or stopped. About 3 weeks after the photograph was taken, Margaret Whitmore committed suicide by drinking laudanum, leaving a note that said she could no longer bear seeing her dead son constantly, that she wanted either to join him wherever he was, or to make the vision stop by ending her own life. Her death devastated the family and intensified the sense that the photograph was not just strange or unexplained, but was actively dangerous, that it was exerting some malevolent influence that was harming the living family members. 2 months later, William Whitmore also took his own life, hanging himself in the barn behind his house. He left no note, but family members reported that he had been experiencing visions of deceased relatives and had been expressing fears that he was losing his sanity, that he could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was supernatural manifestation. His wife Catherine, left alone with their infant daughter, blamed the photograph for her husband's death and demanded that Samuel Whitmore destroy it immediately to prevent any further tragedies. Samuel, now grieving the loss of 2 adult children, in addition to the relatives who had died before the photograph was taken, finally agreed that the photograph should be destroyed. But when he attempted to burn it, the photograph would not catch fire. He held it directly in the flames of his fireplace, but the glass plate and the image on it remained intact, unaffected by heat that should have shattered the glass and destroyed the photographic emulsion. Samuel tried breaking the plate with a hammer, but when he struck it, the glass would not crack or break despite his repeated attempts. Growing increasingly desperate and frightened, Samuel wrapped the photograph in heavy cloth and buried it in his yard, hoping that removing it from the house would end the supernatural experiences that continued to plague his family. But burying the photograph seemed to make things worse, rather than better. The visions intensified, with multiple family members now reporting constant encounters with the dead, seeing deceased relatives throughout their houses, hearing voices calling to them, experiencing what felt like hands touching them when no one visible was near. 3 months after the photograph was taken, Samuel's wife Elizabeth died suddenly of what was officially recorded as heart failure, but what family members suspected was partly caused by the psychological toll of the months of supernatural experiences. Her death left Samuel alone in the house where so much tragedy had occurred, isolated from surviving family members who increasingly blamed the photograph for everything that had gone wrong and who wanted nothing more to do with it or with the patriarch who had commissioned it. Samuel eventually dug up the buried photograph and took it to a Catholic priest, Father Michael O'Connor, explaining what had happened and begging for help in destroying or neutralizing what he now believed was a cursed object. Father O'Connor examined the photograph and was reportedly disturbed by what he saw, particularly by the way the deceased family members appeared in it with such clarity and specificity. He attempted to perform an exorcism of the photograph, using prayers and holy water to cleanse it of whatever supernatural influence it might carry. But these religious interventions had no apparent effect. The photograph remained intact, unchanged, continuing to show its impossible image of the living and the dead together. Father O'Connor eventually advised Samuel to place the photograph in a consecrated location, suggesting that a church or cemetery might contain its influence better than a private home could. But Samuel was reluctant to give the photograph to the church, fearing that doing so might spread its curse beyond his family to affect others who came into contact with it. Meanwhile, word of the strange photograph had begun to circulate in Cincinnati, despite the family's attempts at secrecy. Marcus Bellamy, the photographer, had apparently spoken to colleagues about what had occurred, and stories about the Whitmore family photograph spread through the city's photography community and beyond. Some people dismissed the stories as superstitious nonsense, explained by photographic accidents or by the family's collective delusion or grief. Others were intrigued and wanted to see the photograph, to examine it for evidence of how the impossible image had been created. A local newspaper, the Cincinnati Enquirer, learned about the photograph and published an article in July of 1882 describing the Whitmore family's claims and the deaths that had followed the photograph's creation. The article was skeptical, suggesting that the family had been traumatized by grief and had interpreted a photographically flawed image as supernatural when it was actually just the result of technical error. But the publicity brought unwanted attention to the surviving Whitmore family members, with curiosity seekers visiting their homes and demanding to see the photograph, with spiritualists and mediums offering their services to communicate with the dead family members who appeared in it. The surviving family members were deeply upset by this invasion of their privacy during a time of such profound grief and trauma. Several considered legal action against Marcus Bellamy for having violated Samuel's request for confidentiality, though no lawsuits were ultimately filed. The family retreated further from public life, refusing interviews, avoiding social engagements, trying to process their losses away from the scrutiny of a community that viewed them with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Marcus Bellamy himself faced professional consequences from the publicity. Some clients refused to use his services, fearing that he might produce similarly disturbing images for them. Other photographers in Cincinnati criticized him, suggesting that he must have used some form of trick photography to create the Whitmore image, and that his denial of having done so was dishonest. Bellamy's business declined dramatically in the months following the incident, and by late 1882 he had closed his studio and left Cincinnati, reportedly moving to Chicago, where he hoped to establish a new practice away from the scandal that had destroyed his reputation in his home city. Before leaving, Bellamy gave a final interview to a photography trade journal, in which he maintained his insistence that he had done nothing unusual in creating the Whitmore photograph. He described in technical detail the process he had used, the materials, the equipment, the developing procedures, all completely standard techniques that should have produced a normal family portrait. He acknowledged that he could not explain how the deceased family members had appeared in the image, but he insisted that he had not created their appearance through any photographic manipulation or trick. He ended the interview by saying that the Whitmore photograph had destroyed his career and his peace of mind, that he wished he had never taken it, and that if he could go back and refuse the commission, he would do so without hesitation. Samuel Whitmore died in January of 1883, less than a year after the photograph was taken, officially of pneumonia, but reportedly having given up on life after losing his wife and 2 adult children and being estranged from his surviving family members. In his will, he left the photograph to his grandson, Robert, Margaret's surviving son, with instructions that it should be preserved but never displayed publicly, that it should be kept as a private family record, and as a warning about forces that humans should not attempt to manipulate or control. Robert, who was then 15 years old, inherited the photograph and kept it wrapped in cloth in a locked box, rarely looking at it but unable to bring himself to destroy it, as some family members had urged. As he grew older and had children of his own, he occasionally showed them the photograph, telling them the story of what had happened to their family in 1882, using it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of dabbling in things beyond human understanding. The photograph remained in the Whitmore family for several generations, passed down from Robert to his children and eventually to his grandchildren. It became a family secret, something that was known about but not discussed openly, a source of simultaneous pride and shame, a tangible link to tragedy, but also evidence of something extraordinary that had touched the family. Different family members had different relationships to the photograph, some viewing it as cursed and dangerous, others as merely unusual and historically interesting, still others as evidence of the supernatural that deserved serious study and analysis. In the 1920s, a Whitmore descendant allowed the photograph to be examined by researchers at the University of Cincinnati, who were interested in historical photography and in unusual photographic phenomena. The researchers conducted technical analysis of the plate, using the most advanced methods available at the time to try to determine how the images of the deceased family members had been captured. They found no evidence of double exposure, of composite printing, or of any other form of photographic manipulation that might explain the image. The deceased family members appeared to have been present during the original exposure, to have been standing or sitting in specific locations within the studio, and to have been recorded by the camera along with the living family members. The researchers published a paper describing their findings, noting the technical impossibility of the image, while acknowledging that they could not explain how it had been created. They speculated about various mechanisms that might account for the photograph, including the possibility that deceased people could somehow imprint themselves on photographic materials through some unknown process, or that the intense emotional connection the living family members felt to their deceased relatives might have somehow manifested those relatives in physical or quasi-physical form during the photographic exposure. These speculations were not well received by the broader scientific community, which generally viewed the Whitmore photograph as either a clever hoax that had successfully deceived both the family and the researchers, or as a photographic accident that had been misinterpreted due to the family's grief and desire to see their deceased loved ones again. Skeptics pointed out that photographic technology in the 1880s was not well understood even by those who practiced it, that various chemical and optical phenomena could produce unexpected results, and that attributing unexplained photographic images to supernatural causes was premature when natural explanations had not been fully explored. But supporters of the photograph's authenticity countered that the specific details of the image, the way the deceased appeared aged to match the period when the photograph was taken, the way they were dressed in contemporary clothing rather than in what they had worn when alive, the way they were positioned in relation to the living family members in ways that suggested intentional arrangement rather than random overlay, all argued against simple photographic accident or chemical contamination. If the deceased family members' images had resulted from some previous exposure or from chemical effects, why would they appear so specifically, so appropriately, so clearly integrated into the composition of this particular family portrait? The debate about the Whitmore photograph continued intermittently throughout the 20th century, with the image occasionally surfacing in books about paranormal photography or in academic discussions about the nature of photographic truth. Some researchers attempted to locate the original glass plate to conduct more advanced technical analysis, but the whereabouts of the original plate became uncertain after the 1920s examination, with different accounts suggesting it might have been destroyed, lost, or reclaimed by the Whitmore family and hidden away again. What does survive are multiple photographic copies made from the original plate, copies that show the same impossible image, 14 people visible in the photograph, 7 living and 7 dead, all clearly present, all apparently real, all violating the fundamental boundary between life and death that photography was supposed to respect and record accurately. These copies circulate among collectors of unusual photographs, among researchers interested in paranormal phenomena, and among those who study the history of photography and its relationship to truth, deception, and belief. Modern photographic experts who have examined high-quality copies of the Whitmore photograph generally agree on several points. First, the image does not show obvious signs of the manipulation techniques that were available in the 1880s. The deceased family members are not awkwardly inserted or poorly matched to the lighting and perspective of the scene. They integrate seamlessly with the living family members in ways that would have been extremely difficult to achieve with the technology and techniques available to Marcus Bellamy. Second, the level of detail and specificity in the deceased family member's appearance suggests either extraordinary skill in photographic manipulation or something genuinely anomalous about how the image was captured. Third, the photograph remains unexplained in any definitive sense, with various theories proposed, but none fully accounting for all its features. Some modern skeptics suggest that Bellamy might have been more skilled at photographic manipulation than he admitted, that he might have created the image of the deceased family members as an elaborate joke or experiment, and then claimed ignorance when the family reacted with distress rather than appreciation. But this theory struggles to explain why Bellamy would have created such a disturbing image for a respectable client, why he would have included deceased family members who he would have needed to research, and whose appearances he would have needed to imagine aged to the current period, and why he would have maintained his denials of manipulation, even as it destroyed his professional reputation and drove him to leave the city. Others suggest that the photograph might represent a rare example of thoughtography or psychic photography, where mental images or emotions are somehow imprinted on photographic materials through unknown mechanisms. Proponents of this theory point to the family members' intense focus on their deceased relatives in the days leading up to the photograph, the shared dreams they experienced, and the powerful emotions present in the studio during the exposure as potentially creating conditions where photographic phenomena might occur. Still others propose more mundane explanations involving photographic plate reuse, chemical contamination, or optical effects that might have captured, reflected, or refracted images from the studio's surroundings in ways that happened to resemble deceased family members. But these explanations struggle to account for the specificity of the images, the way they match known appearances of the deceased, and the way they integrate into the composition as if they had been intentionally posed rather than accidentally captured. The psychological and social impacts of the photograph on the Whitmore family were profound and lasting. The suicides of Margaret and William, the premature deaths of Elizabeth and Samuel, all occurred within months of the photograph being taken, and were attributed by family members to the trauma and supernatural experiences associated with it. Surviving family members carried the burden of these losses and the knowledge of the photograph's existence throughout their lives, with many choosing not to have family photographs taken at all, rather than risk repeating whatever had occurred in Marcus Bellamy's studio in 1882. The photograph also affected how the family understood death and the deceased. Before 1882, the Whitmores had generally held conventional Christian beliefs about death and the afterlife, believing that the dead went to heaven or hell, and that communication or contact between the living and dead was not possible except through divine intervention. But the photograph challenged these beliefs, suggesting that the dead might remain closer to the living than theology taught, that boundaries between worlds might be more permeable than doctrines claimed, that deceased family members might continue to have presence and agency in ways that were both comforting and terrifying. Different family members processed this challenge differently. Some abandoned religious faith entirely, feeling that if the church's teachings about death could be so dramatically contradicted by their own experience, then perhaps nothing the church taught could be trusted. Others became more intensely religious, seeking in scripture and in prayer some framework for understanding what had happened, and some protection against further supernatural incursions. Still others developed personal belief systems that tried to reconcile their Christian upbringing with the evidence of the photograph, creating hybrid worldviews that acknowledged both traditional theology and the possibility of continued contact between living and dead. The broader community of Cincinnati also struggled with how to understand and respond to the Whitmore photograph. The newspaper coverage in 1882 had made the case widely known, and throughout the 1880s and beyond, the photograph remained a topic of discussion and debate. Spiritualists pointed to it as evidence supporting their beliefs about continued existence after death and the possibility of communication with the deceased. Religious leaders generally condemned it as either fraudulent or as dangerous dabbling in occult matters that Christians should avoid. Scientists and photographers debated the technical possibility of the image, with most maintaining that some natural explanation must exist even if it hadn't yet been identified. The photograph also influenced the practice of post-mortem photography, which was common in the Victorian era. Families frequently had photographs taken of deceased loved ones, particularly deceased children, as a way of preserving memories and creating lasting records. These post-mortem photographs typically showed the deceased alone or held by living family members, clearly identified as photographs of the dead, rather than suggesting that the dead and living coexisted normally. The Whitmore photograph, with its integration of living and dead in ways that obscured the boundary between them, made some families uncomfortable with post-mortem photography, fearful that attempting to capture images of the dead might invite the kind of supernatural consequences that had befallen the Whitmores. By the early 20th century, as photography became more common and better understood, interest in the Whitmore photograph began to wane. The rise of spirit photography as a documented fraudulent practice, where photographers deliberately created fake images of ghosts and deceased people to exploit grieving families, made many people skeptical of any claims about supernatural photographic images. The Whitmore photograph came to be viewed by many as simply an early example of such fraud, a case where a photographer had tricked a family, and where the resulting tragedy had been unfortunate, but was not evidence of anything genuinely paranormal. But some researchers continued to take the case seriously, noting that unlike most spirit photography, the Whitmore photograph had not been commissioned as such, that the family had not expected or wanted images of their deceased relatives, that the photographer had not profited from the supernatural aspects of the image, and that the reactions of all involved suggested genuine shock and distress rather than satisfaction at having captured something remarkable. These factors distinguished the Whitmore case from typical spirit photography fraud, and suggested that whatever had occurred in Bellamy's studio might deserve more serious investigation. The photograph's continued survival into the present day, despite multiple attempts to destroy it, and despite the family's general desire to be rid of it, has also contributed to its mystique and to arguments that something genuinely unusual is associated with it. The stories of its resistance to fire and to being broken, while difficult to verify and possibly embellished over time, suggest that the photograph was perceived by the family as having properties beyond normal physical objects, as being in some sense indestructible or protected by forces that prevented its elimination. Current ownership of the photograph is uncertain, with the Whitmore family line having dispersed, and with various relatives having different claims about who last possessed the original plate or the earliest copies. Some sources suggest that the photograph is in a private collection held by a descendant who prefers not to be identified and who has declined requests to make it available for modern technical analysis. Other sources claim that the original was destroyed decades ago and that only copies survive, though these copies still show the impossible image that has made the photograph famous among those interested in paranormal phenomena. What remains indisputable is that in March 1882, a photograph was taken that showed 14 people even though only 7 were alive when it was created. This photograph was witnessed by multiple people, was examined by researchers, and caused tragedies that are documented in death certificates, newspaper reports, and family records. Whether the image was created through photographic manipulation, through some natural but poorly understood phenomenon, through the operation of psychological or spiritual forces, or through something else entirely, continues to be debated. But the photograph exists, or existed, and its existence posed, and continues to pose fundamental questions about the nature of photography, death, and the boundaries between the living and the dead. The Whitmore case has influenced how we think about photography as a medium. In the 19th century, photographs were generally viewed as objective records of reality, as mechanical processes that captured what was physically present in front of the camera without the subjective interpretation that affected painting or drawing. The camera, it was believed, could not lie. But cases like the Whitmore photograph challenged this assumption, suggesting that photographs might capture more than just physical reality, that the camera might be sensitive to influences or phenomena that humans couldn't directly perceive, or that the photographic process might be vulnerable to interference or manipulation in ways that compromised its reliability as evidence. Modern understanding of photography acknowledges its constructed nature, the way that choices about framing, lighting, exposure, and development all shape what appears in the final image. We now know that photographs can be easily manipulated, that they can deceive as easily as they can reveal truth. But the Whitmore photograph predates this sophisticated understanding, coming from an era when photographic manipulation was difficult and uncommon, when the technology and techniques required to create fake images of people who weren't present were not widely available or understood. This temporal context makes the photograph more rather than less puzzling, suggesting that if it was manipulated, the manipulation was extraordinarily sophisticated for its time, and if it wasn't manipulated, then something genuinely anomalous occurred. The emotional and psychological aspects of the case are perhaps more important than the technical questions about how the image was created. The Whitmore family experienced profound grief, trauma, and loss in the aftermath of the photograph. Whether or not the image itself was supernatural, the suffering it caused was entirely real. The suicides, the premature deaths, the estrangement of family members, the destruction of the photographer's career, all were tangible consequences of an event that disrupted lives and caused lasting harm, regardless of its ultimate explanation. This human dimension of the story reminds us that mysteries and unexplained phenomena are not just intellectual puzzles to be solved, but are experiences that affect real people in real ways. The Whitmore family didn't want to be part of a famous paranormal case. They wanted a simple family photograph, a normal memento that they could cherish. Instead, they got an image that haunted them, that divided them, that contributed to multiple deaths and decades of trauma. Their tragedy deserves to be remembered with compassion and respect, not just curiosity about the technical nature of the photograph. The case also raises important questions about how we respond to experiences that challenge our understanding of reality. The Whitmore family initially tried to understand the photograph rationally, looking for explanations in photographic technique or in psychological phenomena. When these explanations proved inadequate, some family members embraced supernatural interpretations, while others rejected the photograph entirely. This range of responses reflects the difficulty of processing experiences that violate our fundamental assumptions about how the world works, that force us to choose between accepting the impossible and denying the evidence of our own senses. For those interested in the history of photography, in Victorian culture and beliefs about death, in paranormal phenomena, or in the psychology of how people respond to unexplained experiences, the Whitmore photograph provides a rich case study. It sits at the intersection of technology, belief, grief, and mystery, touching on questions about evidence and truth, about the nature of photographic representation, and about the boundaries between the living and the dead that every human culture defines and polices in different ways. The photograph also serves as a reminder that the past contains genuine mysteries, events and experiences that were documented and witnessed, but that resist complete explanation, even with the benefit of modern knowledge and technology. Not every historical question has a definitive answer. Not every unusual event can be neatly categorized as either fraudulent or genuinely paranormal. Some cases like the Whitmore photograph, remain genuinely ambiguous, supported by sufficient evidence that they cannot be dismissed, but lacking the kind of proof that would settle debates about their nature and cause. In the end, 14 people appear in a photograph taken in Cincinnati in 1882. 7 of them were alive when the shutter opened. 7 of them had been dead for months or years. This is not disputed. What caused the 7 dead to appear in the image, how they came to be captured on the photographic plate, the why they appeared, aged and dressed appropriately for 1882, rather than as they had looked when alive. These questions remain open, inviting investigation, debate, and continued fascination from those who encounter this impossible family portrait. The Whitmore family paid a terrible price for whatever occurred in Marcus Bellamy's studio that March afternoon. Their story, preserved in historical records and in the photograph itself, serves as both a mystery to be investigated and a tragedy to be mourned, a reminder that sometimes the line between the living and the dead becomes troublingly unclear, and that sometimes a simple family photograph can capture more than anyone intended or desired. What do you think happened in that photography studio? Was the Whitmore photograph created through sophisticated manipulation that has never been detected? Could it represent some genuine anomaly in how photographic materials record reality? What does it mean that 7 dead people appear in the image as clearly as the 7 living people who posed? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe to Shadows of America. We release documentaries like this every day at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. EST. Hit that like button, share this video, and let us know what state you're watching from. The past is never truly buried, it's just waiting in the shadows.